Welcome to Got Time with Christopher John, your scholar and gentleman in a hoodie. Much appreciation to my producer, Ron Thomas with TCP, as well as all my subscribers. For those who have not, please like, share, and subscribe. Now, March is Women's History Month, and the 2025 theme is Moving Forward Together, Women Educating and Inspiring Generations. This theme celebrates the collective strength and influence of women who have dedicated their lives to education, mentorship, and leadership. Through their efforts, they have served as an inspiration for all generations, both past and present. But let's go back to the past a little bit with Septima Poinsette Clark, the Queen Mother of the Civil Rights Movement. She played a major role in educating African Americans. She was born the second of 8 children in Charleston, South Carolina, to Peter Poinsette, who was once enslaved, and his wife, Victoria Warren Anderson. Her family struggled to pay for a high school education, yet she graduated from Avery Normal Institute in 1916. Through teaching in segregated schools in various locations, she earned a bachelor's degree from Benedict College in 1942 and a master's degree from Hampton Institute, now known as Hampton University, in 1946. Clark not only taught young students, but she held informal literacy classes for adults. She also created an education and equal rights agenda in numerous organizations such as the YWCA, the Federation of Women's Club, the Council of Negro Women, and the NAACP. In 1956, when South Carolina banned membership in the NAACP, Clark lost her teaching job and pension when she refused to forfeit her membership in the NAACP. Clark endured the injustice and became director of workshops at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. Clark and Bernice Robinson created the first citizenship school to educate African Americans in literacy, state government, and elections procedures. Let me repeat that. A citizenship school to educate African Americans in literacy, state government, and election procedures. I think we need to bring that back. Traveling throughout the South, Clark trained teachers for citizenship schools and assisted in marches and protests. Working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Andrew Young, Dr. King acknowledged Clark when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. One of her most meaningful quotes to me is this: "The power of education lies in the ability to empower individuals and transform communities." Septima Poinsette Clark, the Queen Mother of the Civil Rights Movement. In the spirit of celebrating women in education and in appreciation of those upholding the legacy of women like Septima Poinsette Clark, joining me is a woman who I admire so much. She received her PhD and MA in sociology from Arizona State University and her BA from Grand Valley State University. And while at Arizona State University, she was trained as a family demographer. Her research interests have included education, family, and social stratification. Her recent research examines educational inequality. She is a professor in the Department of Sociology, as well as an amazing wife and mother, and my dear friend, Dr. Littisha A. Bates.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm honored to be here.
It is indeed a pleasure to have you here, Littisha. And so, before we get into the conversation a little bit more, tell us what is keeping you busy these days?
The fact that we're living in the Matrix. But I didn't get a choice of the blue pill or the red pill.
And that means you're our Neo, right?
Yes. I don't know about that, but I think, just trying to navigate all of the changes that are happening politically, specifically as it relates to the educational landscape, and to figure out, like, what is it I can do in this moment? So that is keeping me very busy, along with those children and that husband.
I heard that. So you heard me talk about one of my sheroes, Septima Poinsette Clark. And so who is one of your sheroes that, you look to for inspiration?
It's really interesting, this question. I think how I answer it will depend on sort of the lens through which I'm thinking about it, right? If I'm thinking about, like, where do I get my grit to persevere? As I think about sort of the imprint that I want to make in the educational system, you saw sort of playing off of your acknowledgement of Miss Clark, I think I might choose Miss Marva Collins, who is not a native Chicagoan, but really made her mark in the city of Chicago, starting the West Side Preparatory Academy, which was one of the first of its kind in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, in the Garfield Park neighborhood. And what really sort of set apart sort of her philosophy of education is that she drew on the Socratic method, right? And so, like, in regular people talk, what does that mean? She basically utilized the same sort of methodology that Black folks have utilized for generations to communicate, sort of a call and response, right? The Socratic method is meant to make you think critically, which should be the purpose of education, right? Not to just sort of indoctrinate you with an idea, but to pose a question and to pose a thought and to ask you to think critically about that and to communicate back and forth. And so what she was doing at that time in 1975 was really groundbreaking, because she was educating a population of kids that people would have deemed as uneducatable, right? Like a population of kids that were just going to continue the cycle of poverty, and they weren't worthy to be taught in the way that she was teaching them to critically think. And so I think, as I think about sort of what I want my mark to be, is that I took those folks who some folks might have thought to be the lowest of us, the lowest unworthy common denominator, and I focused my time on ensuring that they have equitable access, despite the fact that people want to misdefine and intentionally misunderstand what that means, right? She put a school in a space where there was no school willing to educate those kids to think critically, and that emanated out to their families. And so I think, if I'm thinking about that in terms of my vocation, she would be someone that I look to. I want to have at least part of the impact that she had.
Now, was that a part of your education? Because you are from Chicago.
I am from Chicago. I am a Chicago native. I did not grow up in the Garfield Park area. I grew up in Washington Park Homes, which is very close to Cabrini Greens. It is now being gentrified. The projects no longer exist. There's a whole conversation we could have about how one goes home.
I watched the second Candyman. Yeah. I know what you're talking about. I saw the regentrification in the second Candyman. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like, how does one go home when their home no longer exists, right? And so I was born in the projects, the Washington Park projects, on 44th and Cottage Grove, and spent most of my life in the city of Chicago. I moved away for a brief stint, but then ended up living there for all of my elementary and high school years. I graduated from Kenwood Academy. Once a Bronco, always a Bronco, and Broncos do it best. So,
well, and definitely, I make no secrets. I am a proud life member of the oldest and coldest Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And for those that my viewers and listeners, you're decked out in that blue is brilliant. And so and I think we were talking before it came on, 23 years.
It was 23 years in April.
All right.
Proud member.
All right, go. Yeah. You can shout out.
I'm a proud member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. I currently belong to the Pi Sigma Zeta chapter in Forest Park, Ohio. I became a member at Grand Valley State, the Chi Xi chapter, in spring of 2003, and it has been one of the best decisions I've ever made. I've always been community minded, but it took me as a young woman developing my identity as a community advocate and was able to help me realize what community advocacy looks like and train me to be a leader. I'm a proud leader in our sorority, having served at various levels of leadership in our sorority. I currently am the sitting board chair for the state of Ohio. And I appreciate that I get to do philanthropy and community service in a variety of outlets of my life, not just my professional life, but also my social life. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's important to highlight the significance of our Greek fraternities and sororities, especially as they too are under fire, with the current climate that's taking place. And so I want to get in a little bit more about the historical context about education, because as I continue to learn more about our beautiful history that represents trauma, it represents joy, it represents a struggle, but it also represents persistence. Education has been at the forefront of uplift. And so it appears as, education as a resource has been very critical in confronting racism and confronting discrimination. And so what are your thoughts about the historical role about education? You talked a little bit about that, but when I talk about education, I'm talking about on all levels, from kindergarten all the way through to, higher education.
Yeah, I might even start before kindergarten and think about Head Start and preschool programs as well, right? I think when we talk about education in the United States, we have to be honest about the history of education in the United States. One of the things that we're up against in this moment is this sort of faux narrative that liberal professors are indoctrinating students. And, we can have a deeper conversation about like what that actually means, but we also have to confront the reality that in the 1600s, education in the US was created for the purposes of indoctrinating students, right? To ensure that they were well-versed on the Bible in the Puritan way, to ensure that they had loyalty to the newly formed nation states and not the monarchy, right? But we don't talk about that. I think we take words and sort of pervert them to mean whatever it is that we want them to mean in the moment. And so what does it mean to indoctrinate someone versus teaching someone? I think what happens is kids go to school throughout the course of the educational cycle, and they learn at home first, right? So this distinction between education and schooling, right? So schooling is the institution by which we go to get education. Education is dispensing new knowledge, creation of knowledge, and the passing down of knowledge, right? Education starts at home. And so if you are educating, one might argue, i.e. indoctrinating your children of the ways of your family at home, and that's all that they know. And this is all that I've ever been taught. I am taught that immigrants are bad and they are flooding our borders, and that's something for me to be concerned about. And then I go to school, higher education, college, and I meet an immigrant and I learn a different perspective. And so then I change my perspective. Families go, oh, they've indoctrinated my kids because they've changed my kids' perspective. No, we did exactly what we were supposed to do. We presented multiple pieces of information. So as Sister Collins did, to create critical thinkers, right? So I've presented you with new forms of information that you weren't exposed to because you were only exposed to the slice of information that your families shared with you as they were educating you in the legacy of your family, which that is fine. But what happens when you're exposed to new truths, right? And we don't talk enough about really what education does is exposes us to new truths, which then requires us to relearn or unlearn some things, which then potentially develops new perspectives that then set us apart from our families of origin, which then people are upset about and they say they're indoctrinating our children. No, actually, I'm teaching them to think critically. And so as I think about sort of the historical legacy of education in this country, we have to be very clear that it was intentionally set up so that we would not have access to critical thinking. So we would not have access, we Black people and our Native brother and sisters, right, would not have access to this form of learning that would really introduce us to new truths, right? So this notion of a culture of poverty, just because I was born in poverty doesn't mean I have to stay in poverty. Well, how do I know that? Because I learned how one gets out of poverty, right? Setting aside the fact that there are institutional barriers to being able to do that. I don't want to pretend like one goes to school, learns something, and then ta-da, you're out of poverty, right? But at least you are able to see a roadmap outside of your own community to understand how one might begin the process of moving out of poverty, for example.
Right. You talked about, it's interesting that, these certain words, critical thinking, has been, as you use the term, perverted.
Yeah.
It's like it's a bad word, like woke and diversity, equity.
I want to stay woke, because if I'm not woke, that means I'm on the other side of the dirt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it just shows a higher level of ignorance that's being plagued in much of our nation. And it's around challenging what education is supposed to look like, where your education should challenge you. It should challenge the way that, your upbringing, your thoughts, your behaviors, more importantly, so that you could be better. And so, while there is this attack on education, how do you see that impacting the work you do as an educator?
At the sort of beginning of all of this, I just sort of sat in the this I'm referring to is the multiple executive orders that we've seen come down, the Dear Colleague letter that came down in February 14th. I sort of just sat and was like, Lord, what are we going to do? But then I was reminded that part of the tactic of what's happening right now is to keep us in a moment of chaos and confused so that we can't think, right? And so what I have resigned myself to do is to think about the ways in which we have built a system, as much as we have participated in building a system, that has been so easily torn apart. And so I think I want to see this in this moment, and I'm saying in this moment because I reserve the right to change my mind as more things continue to happen. But in this moment, I think I want to see this as an opportunity to rebuild a house sturdier and better, to rebuild the foundation of progress and educational equity in such a way that we pay attention to the ways that they were easily able to dismantle them, right? And I think that we, and when I say the we in this context is educators, those of us that are in the educational field, those of us that are diversity, equity, inclusion professionals, we were cautiously excited as people began to pick up the diversity, equity, inclusion work, because it was marching us towards meeting our end in terms of trying to achieve some equitable institutions. And I don't think, at least I can speak for me. I'm sure there were some that were sort of blowing this whistle about like, so what happens when this isn't cool anymore? And this isn't to suggest that I didn't think that they were ever going to think this wasn't cool again. But I don't think that we thought about what dismantling it looked like. We did not, as we were building this work, think very carefully about how easily it could be dismantled. And so now that we're watching the legacy of decades of work being dismantled, I'm paying attention to how they're dismantling it. And so as I work to build it back up, I'm thinking about how can I safeguard us in the next iteration from being able to have it so easily dismantled. And I think that starts with our youth.
Right. And I think a lot of people who were calling for the dismantle of it, I think, as I said previously, this country is entrenched with race, the social construct with race. And so when they look at these initiatives and these programs, they see it as a Black program and not thinking that there are many layers to that. So they're now starting to see, oh, this is impacting veterans. This is impacting those who are disabled. This is impacting a lot of communities that don't necessarily identify with being Black, but I think that speaks to the history of how Black Americans have been at the forefront for justice and equality for all.
Yeah.
And because the focus have been on our Blackness and getting rid of that, other groups are being impacted.
Yeah. I think Black folks, in particular, folks of color, more generally speaking, we have always understood that a rising tide raises all boats. These other folks who are talking about, well, I'm not a DEI hire. You were a DEI hire, sis. Right? And so you may not have understood the frame in that way. But now they are starting to understand that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so now they have a very different perspective. I don't think that they understood that this would impact them. I think that they thought those programs are for those folks over there, and it's okay if you harm them. Just don't mess with me and my people. But now that them and they people are being impacted by it, it's a different sort of thing. I had to pray and ask for forgiveness because I've been watching some interviews of these folks who have talked about the way in which that they voted and how they feel betrayed. And I'm like, well, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes, so I don't feel bad for you. And I was like, oh, that ain't the way to be. Help me, Lord.
That made me think about, I remember I was one of the first individuals I found out in the state of Ohio to be asked about critical race theory when that was a issue. And I guess they came to me because they thought that I had to ask some college. I had to do research. I was like, I don't know what critical race theory is.
Nobody knows except for the people who have developed it.
Right. And so I said, I'm a public historian, but I'm like, so I had to, and I, at the time, at the moment, I gave what my thoughts were at that time. And I lean on that to this very day is that anything that abridges or eradicates the truth isn't good. Is something false being educated about? Is there the statistics, are they there? Does it reveal something, and so forth? And so I think that is very, very important. And so it made me think about that with critical race theory at that particular time. Now, you don't hear it talked about anymore, but it is a part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an old dog whistle. They've moved on to new dog whistles now.
Now, you talked about rebuilding the house when you talk about education. And so I guess a part of that rebuilding gets into my next question as far as, how do we build the house, but how do we protect that house too when we have generations to come? Yeah,
I think if I could answer that question and just have a definitive answer, I wouldn't have a job. I think that there's so much beauty in being a Black woman. Because so much of what people are trying to discover lives in the legacy of my bones. And what I mean by that is it starts with the children. And so I grew up on the south side of Chicago, southeast side, depending on who you ask. I went to Bryn Mawr Elementary School. I think it's now called Boucher. It's also coincidentally the same elementary school that the forever First Lady Michelle Obama went to.
Okay.
And one of the things that I remember, and it's so funny, when I was reading her book, I listened to the audiobook, I could close my eyes and I can see our neighborhood. And one of the things that is a vivid memory for me is the exclusively Black spaces that existed. The school that we went to. When the movie about Fred Hampton came out a bit ago, and people were like, "Oh, who said Fred?" I was like, "Chairman Fred." We learned about Chairman Fred, and so I bring all this up to say it starts with our children. What are we educating our children on? Right? I used to always joke before I had kids, and it is true now. They're gonna go to school, and the history teacher's gonna say Lincoln freed the slaves, and my kids are gonna say lie. Right. That ain't what my mama said. And so just thinking about the ways in which we educate this next generation to make them aware of the world that they're going to go in, and also the world that they belong to, that their history as Black folks is long. The legacy is long. And I've learned that in my all Black school on the South Side of Chicago. And I think that it is our responsibility to ensure that our children know this history and have a legacy understanding of this history. Because without it, they're not going to get it. I'm not waiting on a school to teach my children about Black history. I'm not waiting on a school to teach my children about the various instances in which our people had to fight for the rights of this nation state. And to be clear, Black people have fought for Black people rights, but it wasn't just for us, right? We understood that if we were free, everybody was going to be free. And so I think about how do we move forward? We start with our children and we ensure they understand the legacy of teaching their children and the next generation. I think even this generation of white children that are coming up, they're different. They're asking questions. They're not just sitting by at the picnic and the lynching watching. They're asking questions because they have this advent of social media that is doing exactly what we need it to be doing in some ways. Is again, going back to education, it's exposing them to a variety of truths that is really messing with their minds because it's like, well, that's not what my Mima said. Like, I can't make sense of this.
So you talked about, before the advent of social media, you would get that challenging, that what you're being taught in the home, you wouldn't get that until you're in college.
That's right.
But because of social media, they're getting it much sooner.
That's right.
And so now they're living underneath the roof of their parents while being challenged with that, that information.
It is. And I think this generation that's coming up, even sort of like the young adults right now, they have a very different perspective about how they will use their voices. In some ways, they are sort of reminiscent in my mind of like the freedom rider generation, right? Like those young people were not resigned to just sit on the sideline, both Black and white young folks. They wanted to use their voices. And I think that this generation of kids, they are seeing things and learning things, and they have so much access to information and knowledge that they're able to really seek information to gain a deeper understanding. And I think that is what's terrifying those that are in power right now. They are terrified that their children and their children's children are going to look at them and go, I'm not proud that my lineage stems from you because I see what you did and now I know what I know. And what you did doesn't make sense based on what I know.
Right. So I think, I want to be able to get you out on this as well, is that, my last question is, what do we need to be doing? And so I think you gave a little bit of that, when I started off and I talked about the literacy schools and the things that our forebears were doing outside of the system to educate our children. And it sounds like to me is that we need to pull our strength and resources from that and to create our own safe places.
Freedom schools.
There you go. I think, those opportunities are going to be, very important. I always say that our history is applicable.
Yeah.
What we learn can be applied today. And I think that is something that should be of significance.
Yeah, I think the sort of freedom schools for me are like a perfect template for what needs to happen because of the intergenerational makeup of freedom schools, right? I think you want progress, you get people in the room who know what it was like 50 years ago and who are thinking about what will it look like in 20 years from now, right? And so the template of freedom schools is ideal because it allows us to commune together. It also positions various people to be experts in various ways, right? I think if we talk about the institution of schooling, the sort of issue with the institutional of schooling is that it doesn't sort of take into account fully the impacts or the importance of informal knowledge and informal information and the ways in which education varies in different contexts, right? And so what I learned as a little girl in my neighborhood was absolutely educational because it prepared me to be able to navigate a space in higher education outside of my neighborhood. But you ain't gonna learn that in no school. Right. Yeah. And so setting up these freedom schools to think about the sort of generational hacks that we pass down for how we think about, I think it's important for our young people to know, like, what was it like to have to pass if you were a person of color, a Black person who needed to pass, and how fraught the decision to pass was, right? Yes. How fraught the decision is to live in a suburban community versus living in an inner city if you are a middle class Black person. We have to talk about these tensions, right? And what it means, because it gives them, I think, a deeper value and a deeper understanding for trying to figure out where they can make their mark, because each of us is called to impact in a different way. Some of us got a whole bunch of money, not me yet, but some of us got a whole bunch of money so we can throw money at the problem. Some of us are master strategists and protesters, and so we can make the signs and we can protest. Some of us are educators and we can get out there and educate people on the history of social movements, right? And so I think all of us are needed. People just have to be able to find their niche. People have to be able to find the way that they can make their impact. And I think one of the issues is we think that there's one way to be a resistor, one way to have an impact. No, there are lots of different ways. And you got to find your lane and excel in that thing. Resist is the word of the day.
There you go, resist. I will say this. So for my viewers and listeners, do you have any publications at all or anything in the works?
So this is one of the problems with the Academy. I have a number of publications, but none y'all want to read because they're in social journals, in educational journals. I have a couple of op-eds that are out there. Most of my public scholarship is by way of speaking engagements. One of my proudest moments in a speaking engagement is when I did the MLK speech. Was it 2017? The thing that's so sad to me is that speech is relevant in 2025 as it was in 2017. So I invite folks to check that out and to check me out at my various speaking engagements.
It's been a pleasure to have you here joining. I'm glad that you have time to join us today.
It's been great. I would have made time for you.
March is Women's History Month. And so I have a recommendation for this month, a book, We Refuse by Kelly Carter Jackson. In We Refuse, Carter provides an unflinching examination of the breadth of Black responses to white oppression, particularly those pioneered by Black women. Impassioned and ultimately hopeful, We Refuse offers a fundamental corrective to the historic record, a love letter to Black resilience and a path toward liberation. I highly recommend this book. And so please take a look, and we will share that information as well in the comments for all my listeners and viewers. And so in closing, it's important to know that the truth of our history, it reveals that women have and continue to play a remarkable role in the education and uplift of our communities. Let us not dismiss or forget the resilience and the brilliance of our women. As we move forward, our history is to be appreciated, but is also to be applicable towards the managing of the struggles of today. And our resilient and brilliant women continue to play an essential role. What we do today impact what happens in our tomorrows to come for the next generation. Much appreciation to my guests. Much appreciation to the viewers and listeners. This is Got Time with Christopher John, your scholar and gentleman in a hoodie. Know thy history.